Hello, hello, everyone. I'm gonna try to get out of this projection light. Let's see if I can do it. Great. Thank you all for coming out for this In Conversation program with Carl Cheng and Alex Klein. My name is Rachel Morillo, and I am the DAJ Director of Public Engagement and Research here at the Institute of Contemporary Art. And we're just elated to be able to welcome you all as some of the first folks to see Carl Cheng Nature Never Loses, which marks the first in-depth museum survey dedicated to the innovative and genre-defying work of Carl Cheng. For those of you that were with us last night, I think you could see just how much love, the outpouring of love that's come through for Carl, and today is no exception. It's so great to see so many of you here in person and to have so many folks joining us virtually today. The show is the culmination of several years of close study and conversation between Carl and Alex, and in that way represents the kind of institutional investment that ICA endeavors to have with all of the artists that exhibit here. There's so much to say about this show, and there's so much to see in the show. It's full of archival materials, photographs, installations, and sculptures, innovative projects, so many different media, ideas, concepts, many of which have rarely been seen outside of Carl's studio, so it truly, truly is a special experience. Altogether, the works exemplify how Carl is an artist working in a legacy of tinkerers and boundary pushers, a Bauhaus legacy that does not divorce form from function and instead plays in the liminal spaces between those concepts. Carl's work, which in so many ways materializes a sort of science fiction, reminds me of that of Octavia Butler, another Californian lauded for almost predicting the future. When asked by a student what the answer is to ending the suffering in the world, Butler replied, "There's no single answer that will solve all of our future problems. There's no magic bullet. Instead, there are thousands of answers, at least." In these artworks on view, I see hundreds of solutions and problem sets Carl has fully realized, all with his own hands, which to this day is just so, resonates for me so much. And so we often hear the word prescient used to describe Carl's work, which by that we mean he was discussing climate change before the term existed, that he warned us of the dangers of human impact on the environment before the term Anthropocene was coined. Yet spending time with Carl and with his works, it's become clear that what he's positing is that technology as a material process is not outside of nature, and instead it reframes the relationships between humans, the environments we inhabit, and the tools and technology we create, asking us and prompting us to really delve deep into those relationships. As we continue to assess our relationship to the lands that we occupy and witness the large-scale impacts of humans on the natural environment, Carl's work offers us questions and prompts us for pathways to move forward. The hope and urgency that is there certainly is necessary in these times. And so today we'll have a conversation between Carl and Alex Klein, the exhibition's curator. Before I introduce and hand things off to Alex, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the partners and supporters who have helped make this exhibition a reality. Carl Cheng Never Loses received major support from the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage and additional support from the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, as well as the National Endowment for the Arts and Tiger Foundation. We'd also like to thank our board of advisors and all of the individual supporters who made this exhibition possible. Special thanks goes to Philip Martin Gallery, the Art and Technology Lab at LACMA, Red Cat in Los Angeles, for their generous support in restoring and displaying Carl's work. There are also a few folks in the audience that we'd like to thank, including Rachel Eboh, Curatorial Fellows Emily Lafer and Pell Tracy, studio assistants Maya Buffett, Davis and Markel Collins, as well as the entire ICA Curatorial Affairs team and our installation crew. So just to give you a heads up about what to expect, Alex and Carl will speak for about 50 minutes. From there, we'll open things up for Q&A, so save your questions for then. For the folks joining us virtually, you can submit your questions and comments in the chat. We'll be monitoring it there. After that, you're invited to join us upstairs on the mezzanine for some refreshments and for mingling. And now to introduce Alex. Alex Klein is the head curator and director of curatorial affairs at the Contemporary Austin, where she works alongside the curatorial team to shape the exhibition program at the Jones Center and steward the sculpture park at Laguna Gloria. Most recently, she has generated exhibitions with artists including Jab Prashkul, sorry, I should have asked you how to pronounce that, Lubina Hamid, Guadalupe Maravilla, and Sable Elise Smith. Prior to her current role, she was the Dorothy and Stephen R. Weber CHE 60 senior curator right here at ICA. During her 11 years here with us, she originated numerous exhibitions, publications, public programs, and online initiatives with artists including Linda Goodbryant, Barbara Caston, Michelle Lopez, and Sandra Perry. Previously, she held positions at the Carnegie Museum of Art's Hillman Photography Initiative, the Wallace Annenberg Photography Department at LACMA, the Roski School of Fine Arts at USC, and at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. She has published widely and is a founding member of the Arts Workers Advocacy Group, Museums Moving Forward. Please join me in welcoming Alex and Carl to the stage.
Thanks so much, Rachel, and thanks to everyone at ICA. It's really such a pleasure to be back here, and it's a wonderful just capstone to my time here. And so there's so many friends and dear colleagues in the audience, so thanks for coming out today. And thank you so much to Carl for being along for this ride. This is the second venue in a 5-venue tour. So we originated the show in Austin and traveled it back here to ICA, where I had actually conceptualized the show about 5 years ago. And it's going on to the Bonnefanten in Maastricht after this, and then on to the Tangli Museum in Basel. We're very happy to have Andres Pardi here today with us from the Tangli, and then it will conclude in Carl's hometown of Los Angeles at the ICLA. So, we've been thinking a lot about LA this week. Carl's work is very much of Los Angeles. It's for those of you who haven't gone through the show yet, the context of LA looms large in the show and is very much at the heart of how Carl came to make the work that he did. So we've been thinking a lot about our friends and family there and what Carl is going back home to. So just wanted to kind of give a shout out to our friends there and let them know that we're thinking of them. So the show has really been almost 5 years in the making, and there's, to Rachel's point, there's too many people to thank. I wanted to really just thank again the Pew for their really foundational support, and also Tiger, who also joined up with us on a climate initiative and helped pair us with Root Collaborative, who are climate consultants, and have really encouraged us to think about the sustainability and infrastructure on the back end of the show as we were making it, and not just the topics. So all of the partners in the tour have come together to also do a kind of carbon study. So it's really been through collaboration and collegiality that we've been able to work together to try to think about best practices for the field going forward. So thank you very much for that. And then also, again, to Philip Martin for some of the crucial support early on, providing research assistance. Carl and I started working together during the pandemic, and we're scanning things out of the studio, and really couldn't have done it without him. And then, again, to Rachel Eboh, the curatorial assistant on the show, who's been such a fabulous thinking partner. Okay, so there we go. Here we go. So the show surveys 6 decades of Carl's practice. And for those of you who were here last night, we're going to touch on some of the things, but we're going to go more in depth, more of a behind-the-scenes walkthrough of the whole exhibition and Carl's career and how he came to make what he makes in his perspective. So Carl has predominantly worked outside of the institutional structures that have supported artists, museums, galleries, and found other ways to work in public art and ephemeral installations, and really within his own kind of construct. So there's a way in which his work is incredibly consistent, but it's also really multifaceted. So the exhibition is organized in 6 sections to help to give you a foothold in this really ambitious, multidimensional practice that has been probing the intersections of identity, technology, and ecology since the beginning. And it's really humbling to think about the way that Carl has really centered the human within the space of nature and technology. So this is the way that I first came to Carl. So as Rachel mentioned, I have a background in photography. I was working in the photography department at LACMA in the early 2000s. And I knew about the molded plastic photographs that Carl had made and that were exhibited in the Photography into Sculpture show in 1970 at MoMA, curated by Peter Bunnell. And it was really a moment where artists were really trying to push outside of the frame, push against the kind of traditions of the zone system. A lot of experimentation coming out of California. Students of Robert Heineken were in this show. And this is what I knew about Carl. He was one of my favorite artists in this kind of expanded photographic exhibition. But it's kind of where my knowledge of him began and ended. And then I saw this, the erosion machines. Blew my mind. And I realized that I didn't know anything about this artist, and I needed to go back and try to learn more. And it's a really wonderful feeling when you think you know something, and then all of a sudden you go, wait a second, I obviously don't know anything at all, and it ruptures your view on things. And it started a multi-year process of wanting to learn more and just trying to see more work. And then I did that, and then we reached out to Carl and invited him to do the show, and we started meeting every Monday for 2 hours over Zoom because there was no book that we could go to or I could go to find out the story of Carl. And so it was really about going directly to Carl and going through his archive, and we would meet over Zoom, during the height of the pandemic, and just go through year by year by year and have Carl tell his story. And we amassed a huge archive and started really just it's almost like a physical exam for an artist studio. Like just going in, getting dates correct, going through CVs, going through archival material, going to archives, trying to get other kinds of sources together and trying to put together a big kind of, basically a massive Excel spreadsheet. So I was very fortunate to have some doctoral students along the way who worked with me to help organize some of this material. Here we go. This just to give you a sense what we started to do. And we realized that, not only did we, or did I not, maybe know the full story about Carl or, had preconceptions about him as a photographer, I also it was really hard to start to even put his work into any kind of system because Carl makes nature machines and art tools. And these are the ways that he talks about his work. And are they sculptures? Are they, what are they products? It's very hard. They kind of defy the methodologies, traditional art historical methodologies and categorization. So that was something that was also very interesting, is to kind of go back to the artist to kind of learn almost how to start to talk through the work. And this is also just some behind the scenes of the team from Austin. A lot of work going into the show of, bringing works back up to exhibitionality. So there's only actually 6 outside loans in the exhibition. Everything else is coming directly out of Carl's studio. So just wanted to kind of foreground that as, it's really special to be seeing these works all together. So Carl, after that kind of preamble, how are you feeling?
Oh, good. Sure. Keep going.
All right, you're going to talk more at some point. So maybe I can invite you to talk a little bit about your background and I'll give you some biography. So Carl was born in San Francisco, but moved, I think, when you were 2 years old, you said, to Southern California, and really grew up in the Southern California area, in the Valley, seeing orchards turning into tract homes. You went to the same high school that Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor went to. You took a summer art class with Robert Irwin. You did your undergrad at UCLA. So you're like a quintessential Angelino in many respects. Can you talk a little bit about your family upbringing?
Yeah, sure. First, I'd like to introduce my partner, artist Felice Monterey, who's been with me for 60 years. So, Felice. So there's part of my family right there. This picture is kind of embarrassingly familiar. In my case, I have five brothers, or 5 boys in our family. So no girls, so it was a very lopsided family. This is a picture of my youngest brother's first birthday. And so you can see a whole bunch of Chinese Americans, first generation types that nobody knew who we were. We lived in a place in San Fernando Valley where there was very few Asians, or anybody actually. So it's basically a very white population. So because we had so many boys and there's so many of us, we weren't treated badly. I mean, it was kind of a curiosity to see, well, who are these people, you know? And so these pictures kind of relate to our bringing up in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, and various stages of our youth. And yeah, so what can I say about it? This is me and the second guy there. So we all grew up together. Bob, myself, and my youngest brother at that time was Fuding. We were only about a year apart. So we kind of grew up in a very close proximity to each other, and we're kind of like triplets in a certain way, because we went to the same schools together at the same time. So because of that, we became very popular because we knew everybody in every grade. And so we ended up knowing everybody in the school. So like I say, we didn't have a lot of problems with prejudice and stuff, but so just the curiosity of that many brothers in one school was something else. So we were treated well. So what else can I say about these guys? So there's a kind of that's sort of a mid-50s. My mother was the artist in the family, and we managed to get a house in Sherman Oaks, and it was sort of a mid-50s style house, and there's a mid-50s family that's sitting in there on that side. We're all dressed up properly, and everybody looks cool. So that's
There's a lot more to say about your family, but we'll keep moving.
Okay, good.
So, Carl, you went to UCLA for your undergrad in industrial design and art. You went on to the Volkswagen Hochschule in Essen, and where you had a kind of a Bauhaus-inflected education where art and industry is coming together. And I love this cool Carl picture here in the right in Germany. And then you come back to UCLA where you do your graduate work in art. And that's also where you come into contact with Robert Heineken, who's founded the photography program at that time. And one of the things that was really interesting to me learning about this background was that you said that you gravitated towards industrial design and photography because the pedagogy at the time was quite conservative. Is that an accurate?
Yeah.
The art pedagogy.
I think it's a matter of using materials and stuff. I mean, if you were thinking of traditional art at that time, it's basically carving and bronze casting or wood carving or metal, sculpting. So it's basically from one material that you would make art, and you work that material until it becomes something. Whereas in the industrial design idea of life, fabrication is more the way of doing things where lots of things are put together to make something. So in my case, I kind of latch on to the Bauhaus idea of artists working in industry. So fabrication was something that I was familiar with, and using processes that just made the thing. So that's sort of my background rather than carving.
And I think that's really interesting, though, is that you really have you've a facile ability to work with materials. I mean, you can use plastic mold materials. You can go between. You can basically make anything, and that's something that I find really impressive about your practice because of this your training in industrial design. Carl, when you go into the exhibition, keep in mind that everything you see Carl made himself. He was never working with outside fabricators. He was never working with studio assistants, with the exception of when he's working on large-scale public art projects. And I think that's something like today we often take for granted, that artists have a bevy of assistants working in their studios to make things or working with outside fabricators. Now, Carl is actually working with the mold making machines himself. Carl also, kind of a factoid is that he spent a short time working as a model maker for Charles and Ray Eames. And I always latch on to that. I know it was a brief moment in time, but it's an interesting thing to kind of think about also, like the models and the miniature that reappears over and over again in Carl's practice.
Right.
Maybe also just a little context, 60s, Carl was involved in, anti-war activities and protests, and here Carl is with Felice, a lot of time out in the desert. We've talked a lot about, we're working on the catalog right now, and it's really important that it's not just the works that are appearing in chronology and process, but also the world that Carl is living as an artist. And we've talked a lot about the life outside of art and your ethos. And I think that, knowing that Carl is going out into the desert with Felice and they're going out and experiencing nature. I mean, the context of the landscape in Los Angeles is heavily influenced some of the decisions that Carl is making as an artist. And then also, here down here, you have the junkyard. I think that kind of context, Rachel and I were talking about how LA has this kind of constant teetering between utopia and dystopia, as we're seeing right now. I mean, it can be the most beautiful place and the most kind of tragic place at the same time. Anything to say about that, Carl?
Well, we're sitting here eating at a place called Rutt's Hut, where if you came at the right time, you get the special, which consists of 3 eggs and cholesterol and everything else. But it was very good in those days to, we could go there and really feast. But I look at these 3 eggs. I mean, that's pretty heavy. These days, you really watch it.
So here's Carl in his studio. We've brought some of this into the context of the show too. One of the anecdotes that Carl has often talked about is that curators would come into his studio space and they'd say, "Where's the art? Where's the artist? What is this, a studio space?" Because they would encounter these mounds of, gadgets and gears. And, one of the things to keep in mind is Carl's also, culture in Los Angeles as Carl is growing up is not the big museums and gallery scene that we think of Los Angeles today. It's really the post-war aerospace industry and Hollywood. Those are the dominant cultural forms. And that's part of what's also informing some of the decisions that Carl is kind of making as an artist as he's coming of age. So, you kind of almost look at this scene here and think of like an inventor. Carl also spent time traveling with Felice, living all over Asia, and this kind of everywhere that Carl and Felice would go, they would set up these itinerant studios. So you can see in hotel rooms or wherever you were living at the time. And Carl was recounting how he had a backpack with all these kind of hand tools, and you'll see in the exhibition all of these kind of organic materials that Carl is modifying and making these little small-scale sculptures that he would then send home to himself. So no matter where Carl is, he's always making and always finding ways to make. And we'll talk a little bit later about the importance of these travels on your practice. So the show starts with these works, Anthropocene landscapes, and they just get more and more rich. I think with every day. I've been thinking a lot about the kind of aerial views we're starting to see out of Los Angeles of all the kind of the burnt out neighborhoods, and I can't help but map them onto these now. They're from 2006. There's 3 of them, and Carl has talked about how they're an image of the land from 30,000 feet and 5,000 or 6,000 feet. The one that is closer has larger scale kind of circuit boards and computer chips that are maybe older and have kind of larger, clunkier. And then as you zoom out and the technology gets more refined, they become smaller, and that's the 30,000 feet. But Carl has talked a lot about no matter how advanced our technological systems get, we're still bound by these kind of rigid lines of the circuit board or the computer chip. And what would it mean if we had actually developed technological systems that were based on biomorphism or plasmas and other kind of organic forms? And that is actually, there are other theories around technological production. So there's a way that our technological progress has also maps onto certain the rigidity of kind of capitalism and the way that we have developed the landscape. Carl, would you like to talk about the Anthropocene landscapes, or?
Yeah, I mean, you're basically right. What it looks like is a straight line technology, which is our current computers. And what my imagination takes me is something more organic. So it does look like our geography of our human landscape, because we have roads and stuff that takes us from one place to another. And right now, in order to do those AI, huge computer, all the advances, you need an entire building to put all the circuit stuff in it. So someday we'll maybe, it doesn't even equal a human brain, which is very small compared to a building. So my imagination takes me to something that's organic, maybe plasma, or maybe a goopy object that you're feeding into that does all that kind of work that a building takes right now. So we're on a kind of fringe of technology in terms of that kind of scale. So it's just mind-boggling that you take a building like in New York City that's filled with whatever electronic parts that has to be air-cooled even, and just to make it so we can do the kind of robotic technology that we use today. And I can imagine something that's much more complex, but simpler. One of the examples I like to use is what happens when 2 ants meet. They just touch for a second, and then chemically, that ant knows that the mother ant is making more soldiers today and less workers. So things like that are still in the future, but whether we'll ever get there, I don't know. So.
Well, I think also it's important to mention the title, Nature Never Loses. The show could have also been Nature Always Wins or Nature is Everything. These are phrases that Carl often talks about, and these are called the Anthropocene landscapes. The Anthropocene is the geologic era, or commonly kind of referred to era of when human kind of production starts to affect the actual kind of geological matter. Carl also studying in a university context, one of the things you talked a lot about was that, being at UCLA, you weren't just studying, industrial design and art, but you were going and taking geology classes and ducking into the medical school and really getting a full, kind of humanist education where you were being exposed to a lot of different disciplines. And I really see that infusing a lot of the decisions in your work. So these are from 2006, but the idea of the Anthropocene is something that Carl has been kind of unpacking from, the very beginning in his work. And I think, we've talked about how his work feels really prescient. And, I had a lot of people at the openings, come up to me and say, wow, this is just so on the nose. It's like, this is so timely because of everything that's happening in LA. But Carl's been making this work for decades. And one of the first things you've said to me was, it's not prescience, I'm a documentarian. Do you want to reflect on that?
Well, I don't feel like I'm, predicting the future for anybody. It's just that I'm living our present. And I am documenting what we are doing. So it comes from a more natural attitude than actually conceptually trying to push it. So if it reveals itself as to being very present, then that's what it is, because I didn't try to do it. It's just what I did. And that's the point, is that there is no, I'm not driving towards something. I'm trying to experience more completely what we are doing today. So that's pretty much what it is.
And I think it's important to remember, I mean, the 1960s and 70s in Los Angeles, I mean, the air quality was pretty crappy from what I understand. There were no car emissions at that time. So I think also just to check ourselves when we think about these ideas of, climate change, is that the climate has been changing, the environment has been affected by humans for a very long time, and there seem to be disasters after disasters that we kind of forget about. We have a kind of amnesia. So, I think it's really interesting to think about the way you've been signaling this in your work from the very beginning. And then also just one last thing about this work, there's a real kind of just incredible material play. I mean, Carl, I can't even figure out how he would have found all of these circuit boards and figured out how to put them together to make these landscapes. There's a lot of just, there's no one medium that Carl is working in. Anything can become fair game for art practice. And then this idea of the miniature or the landscape view is something that's repeated over and over again. I was talking with the art historian Gloria Sutton, who's writing an essay for the catalog, and we were discussing how sometimes the miniature or this idea of this aerial view can sometimes help us start to process these bigger ideas like climate change that are almost like too big to actually process, because we can't really take them in, but there's something about seeing them in this kind of form that we can start to kind of wrap our heads around it. So I'll just kind of start to escort us through the show. And so I mentioned that Carl had been in this exhibition, Photography into Sculpture, where he was making these three-dimensional plastic molded photographs that were really just like a way to kind of make a photograph. You were playing around with how to make a photograph into a sculpture, how to make it three-dimensional form. But there are other key works in this section that I encourage you to spend time with. Landscape essay. You'll see images of nature and viewing the landscape, framing the landscape over and over again in Carl's work. This is a key work from 1967, where Carl is also playing with the rigidity of photographic practice and pushing against the idea that there's a correct way to take an image or the correct way to print an image. So Ansel Adams famously had the zone system, where there were correct gradations of black, gray, white. And so something about that idea of like questioning the correct way to make art is a through line within his practice. This also pertains to the Scroll series in the late 70s, when you had the opportunity to go to China just as it was opening up, and there was a scarcity of materials for artists, and there was you were kind of questioning the mustard seed book of how to, like, the correct way to make a landscape painting. And so he was using these kind of cheap scrolls and framing kind of famous views, and it also becomes about like kind of what's outside of the frame. So one of the key things to know about Carl's practice is that for 3 decades, Carl had a rooftop studio in Santa Monica, a studio that you shared with different artists over the years, like Pat O'Neill and Maria Nordman. And on the rooftop, you were basically playing with different weathering effects. You would leave objects outside to be affected by the wind, the rain, the sun, and see how they would change. And there's a part of your practice we're talking about, like chance operations and experimentation, where you will set up a scenario and then kind of see what will happen. Is there anything you'd like to talk about in terms of this rooftop studio and some of the things you were doing up there?
Well, I don't know if it's a laboratory, but it's basically a place where I could put anything on junk in otherwise and just leave it there. And then see it years later, oh my God, it changed a little bit here and there. So it didn't start out as a formal laboratory. It was just a place to store stuff. And that's what it ended up giving me a lot of ideas. So there's boxes in there where I just started sort of classifying if I, fish heads or anything that I ate or what, it would be in there. And then just let it just weather until something happened to it. So it's pretty much like that. It's
So
more of a
Carl
discovery.
recycles everything. Everything becomes part of the practice. And so part of the challenge of this show was also so also on the roof, Carl was making California bonsai. So Mickey Mouse ear kind of looking things out of cacti and making these kind of California bonsai views. So growth, decay, erosion, these are all key ways that Carl makes his work, collaborating with the weather. And so then those ideas, those processes, get folded into the nature machines that Carl's making. So here are the erosion machines. And is this going to play? Nope. If I go back, how do I get this to start? Is it starting? Oh, there it goes. Okay, so what you're seeing is a product, and it's called an erosion machine. So remember, Carl's doing these experiments on his roof. So in 1969, those get kind of, reproduced within one of these nature machines. There's 5 erosion machines. There's 5 brothers. The number 5 comes up a lot in the work. On the right, you're seeing the machine, the erosion machine, that is marketed as having different spray functions to erode the objects, to reproduce the effects of erosion. And on the left, you would have human rocks, replacement human rocks for when the rock on the right would erode. Carl has said that rock could take 1,000 years to erode, 10,000 years to erode. So suddenly you have this product to erode the human rocks, and it's going to outlive you, me, everyone we know. It's outside of our kind of human existence. And I think that's really interesting. Also mapping onto more contemporary ideas around like the geology of media, for example. And so as these rocks were to erode, there'd be different things that would come out of them. And Carl, you've talked about the human rock as being like a broken toaster.
I think it's a matter of function. Like we make all kinds of products that are human-made, and they serve a purpose. And a toaster is a good example. It's supposed to make toast. But as soon as it doesn't make toast, it's just a junk, a piece of nothing. And it happens to be made by humans, so I just call them human rocks. And I could use them either functionally or take out the function of it, or else just use it as a lump. So it kind of got conglomerated into what I just generally call human rocks. Anything that we touch can become a human rock as soon as it loses its function. And there's thousands and thousands and millions of products that we make that don't function anymore. So what do you do with it? And that's what I call human rocks, sort of in a general way.
And then when they get thrown away, they become part of the landfill and part of the landscape. So this is a good 30 years before people are actually like using the word the Anthropocene. When these works were shown in 1975, you can see them here exhibited at Caltech in the gallery at Caltech with some of his erosion series. So there's some of the sculptural experiments Carl had made on his rooftop, and on the underbelly of the erosion machines, on the pedestals, there's these kind of environments where Carl would have had like these little ecosystems with plants and bugs. And I imagine that going to an early Carl Cheng exhibit things would have been kind of like escaping out of the cracks and flying around, which pertains also to this piece, Supply and Demand. So I should just mention there's a lot of humor in Carl's work, but at the same time that there's this kind of biting critique. So having this background in industrial design, Carl became really critical of the kind of branding of the artist, and also the notion of planned obsolescence within capitalism. So the idea that objects are built to fail, so you have to consume more. So what you're looking at is a product that Carl developed called Supply and Demand, and on the left, there's an insect breeder, as he calls it, where aphids would have been, and then they go in through that tube, and then they get consumed by the Venus flytraps. So one can think about that as a critique of capitalism, but also a young artist being confronted by the pressures of the market to produce. We mentioned that Carl and Felice spent a couple of years traveling around Indonesia, Japan. Carl, do you want to talk a little bit about this time in your life, and we can talk about how it affected your practice?
Okay. Well, in the late '60s and early '70s, you know, we were basically. I grew up in the '60s, and I was at UCLA in those times. So, Vietnam War and other things. There was a lot of protests. Racial prejudices were addressed. Homophobic attitudes toward women. So there are a lot of things that we thought we brought up and tried to solve in one way or another in demonstrations. And so one of the things was to go to other cultures. You know, American culture wasn't enough. So we happened to went to Japan first, and then we kind of migrated to Southeast Asia and Bali, and then we went to India, and then we came back to Japan, and then came back home. But in our travels, we saw life in a very different way, and artists that, you know, our orientation as artists is to produce something that's saleable. And so this is sort of a capitalistic idea of an artist, whereas in Southeast Asia and other places, artists were just like poets. I mean, there are people respected in their communities, and they did what they could to get by, and, you know, they might make art in one way or another, but they weren't commercial successes necessarily. And that was something that I really caught on to in terms of seeing artists that, you know, they don't have this burden of trying to be a success in terms of making as much money as you can. And so what we experienced were these types of people that were more like poets that, you know, had a mind that's, you know, pretty advanced, and just hanging out with them. And so this picture in the middle in Bali, we just went into the coconut groves and rented a place and just stayed in there. And it was kind of idyllic. There was no electricity. There was a common water source in the property. Then you use lamps at night, and a zillion mosquitoes would be biting you. So we learned a whole nother lifestyle. And this is what we did. We traveled along and adjusted ourselves in one way if we could. And from that, I came back with some very different ideas of what art should be. So let's just leave it there.
Well, I mean, picking up on that, what I've gathered from you is that it ruptured not just what art could be, but who it could be for, where it could be located. So really kind of stepping outside of this need that art needs to be encountered in art spaces and museums, and the kind of hierarchy that's produced between maybe a viewer and an artist, or a viewer and a curator when that happens. And you talked about, you know, encountering like Buddhas in temples and not knowing like who had made them, and this idea of anonymity. So I think that's really powerful. So these are some of the types of objects that Carl is making and shipping back to himself. They're called the emotional tools and unspecified artifacts. You know, you also mentioned the height of the Vietnam War, and there's a really haunting photograph from 1967 in the gallery of your brother Bob. And I remember you saying that you had wondered what would happen if you were shipped off to Vietnam. Would you be perceived of as the enemy? And I often return to that as, you know, at least just like something as a heaviness that you must have carried with you, and that also must have been kind of complicated by some of these voyages that you were on. So this is the Avocado Laboratory. So kind of fast forward to 1998. The idea of the artifact, the specimen, you have these kind of counter museums that run a lot in Carl's work. It's another kind of thread. I think a lot about how, you know, now we have a Museum of Drastic Technology and the Center for Land Use Interpretation. Carl is playing with those kinds of terminologies and taxonomic systems and categories like from the very beginning in your practice, which I find very, very interesting. But there's also just like an incredible joy in making, and that's something, again, I want to underscore, is that, you know, alongside all of these big issues that Carl is, you know, you can kind of take out of Carl's work, there's also just this like, incredible. He's relishing making things. Do you want to say anything about the avocado laboratory before we move on?
Well, it's just another example of having a lot of debris after eating all those avocados, trying to figure out what to do with them. There's one element of the avocado seed that made me kind of get into it, was that the seed itself, if you take the shell off of it, it's a very pinkish kind of beige colored thing. And if you accidentally slice it with a knife or anything, as it dried up, it would turn into a scar, much like what happens when you carve something in a tree and the bark changes as it ages into a giant little thing, So what I saw was that in 3 months or 6 months, as the seed dried up, that little scar would get darker and darker, and it'd really be a prominent item in that dried up seed at the end of it all. So I started playing around, making impressions in those kinds of seeds and letting them sit around on my mantle in the kitchen, and just seeing that they started turning into what looked pretty aesthetic to me, which was these little items would just turn into this item that kind of protruded out of the seed or kind of indented into it or something, and made a very distinct shape or size or something of what I inscribed in them. So that kind of led me into playing with the shells of them, or the outside of them too, because they can dry in various ways if you did this or that to them. And so that created this whole series that ended up being this avocado laboratory. No matter what I did to it, something would come out of it. And you could do things. I even tried sewing them together at one point and seeing what that would do. But it's just kind of playing around with them that led to this whole series.
So between 1966 and 1970, Carl started working under the name John Doe Co. And there's several reasons for this, some of which kind of evolved over time. So first being that your accountant had recommended that it would be good for your taxes to be a company, right? And so he could write off expenses. Two, Carl is, working with industrial materials. So if he calls up a supplier in Burbank for some plastics and says, "I'm Carl Cheng," they might not do business with him. But if he says, "I'm John Doe Co.," you're in business because you're a company. It doesn't matter how ridiculous the name might be. Three, we know Carl is critical of the branding of the artist, and you're interested in this idea of working kind of anonymously. And so what better way to do that than to become a brand yourself, John Doe Co. It's almost like Acme or something like that. It also, John Doe, it's the height of the Vietnam War. It has a coding to it, whether you mean it to or not. A lot of John Does coming home at that time. It also erases one's name, so it erases race, sex, individuality. You become, an entity. And then later on, there's a kind of an association. Carl has talked a lot about how Marcel Duchamp was a very important figure for him. So the performativity of something like Eros de la Vie, and the way that Duchamp moved between different materials. So what you're looking at here is one of the key products of the John Doe Co. It's called Early Warning System. Made in 1967. It was Carl's first mature sculpture. On the left, you're seeing what it was originally looked like, and then it evolved over the years. Carl, if anything is in Carl's studio, he'll continue to upgrade it, almost like technology. He's not precious with his work. You're one of the things I really admire about your practice is it's almost like all alive. You're like, well, if we have LED lights, why don't we just put LED lights in here? And you're constantly refining things so they don't become obsolete. The early warning system is imagined as a predictor for oncoming disasters, whether they be weather disasters or the kind of the crisis of the human in a way. What you see is there would be a radio that is broadcasting the live maritime weather, so to almost like predict some sort of catastrophic weather event coming your way. And inside there's a rotating projector that is showing, originally it showed kind of humans from different evolutionary perspectives, and now it's become kind of human encroachment on the land, oil spills, waste dumps, things like that. So this is a work that does feel kind of prescient and urgent from today's perspective when one sees it. But there was also a way in which you were almost like you were pitching them as speculative products, right? If you had been invited to the exhibition in 1970, Carl had product cards, which you can see in the gallery, and you can see award-winning design, integral dual projection indicator with audio synchronization. So almost like riffing on the language of like, the commercial object. And I love this kind of factoid. When we were looking in your archive, we found this kind of brochure of when you'd shown this at the Barnsdall Art Park, that it was the $1,000 award winner in like 1968, I think, and the other $1,000 award winner was David Hammons with a body print. So I love to think about just like the cultural scene at that time, who might have been in the same room at the same time, kind of floating around each other. There's a lot of work in the show that really has never been seen before, so working with Carl to bring things back into visibility. So this is, again, one of the challenges was like how to point to large-scale public artworks or performances. And thankfully, Carl was very good at documenting his work and saving things. So this is an intervention. He did technology giveaway in 1970. There was a big conference at USC that was the Experiments in Art and Technology program. Carl, do you want to talk a little bit about the technology giveaway? Because I think it's a very important work.
Yeah, okay. In one respect, art and technology was to me was like a fad, because it's like a new movement like Cubism or something, and so a lot of artists, okay, now we're going to officially work with technology, whereas people like myself have never not worked with technology, and it didn't mean anything other than the fact that you're using materials and processes. So when it came down to this thing about, let's have artists work with technology, and so what happened was there was a big event at USC that was talking about this kind of idea, which is artists are now officially working with technology. So they invited a lot of the blue chip or high-end New York artists like Andy Warhol and others to work in technology officially. So they put artists with industries to try to make something out of it. But in my own process, it seemed like a complete artificial item, because then after you do that, then you can give it up. You do what you normally do. So what I did, in my reaction to it was since I was John Doe Company, I could do something that was anonymous. So I just gathered about quite a lot of industrial waste that I could go to around Santa Monica, San Fernando Valley, where the aerospace and motion picture industries were. There was a lot of surplus places, and you could just buy it at 3 cents a pound. So there's some very exotic technology that was basically thrown away. So I just packaged some of that with some friends, and we just gave it away at the conference. And it was quite successful in the fact that it was cleaned out, but because everything was free. So basically that was my opinion of what technology was supposed to be at the time. And I still continue to use technology, but not in that way. So it's just basically maybe a sophomoric reaction to what I thought was not that, to make a movement out of it and then walk away from it was not where I was at with it.
So just some of the other key objects. So we have the emergency nature supply kit from 1970 that Carl made while he was living in Japan, where he also befriended founding members of the Gutai group, for example. And the emergency nature supply kit is imagined as a kind of maybe a stylish purse that, when opened up, can give you an emergency nature supply when we are confronted with a future where we may need one, where we have created such a concrete jungle that you need your emergency nature supply. And so there's an accompanying film that shows Felice wearing a silver bodysuit and a medical mask, carrying her stylish emergency nature supply kit, opening it up, having a tuft of grass and some bird songs, and then is transported out to the beach. So I think we're all going to need our emergency nature supply kits very soon. There's also another kind of strand in Carl's work where there's almost like a McLuhanite critique of media. These are the alternative TVs. And then another key product of the John Doe Co. is the first generation family entertainment center, which is a synthetic kind of wave machine that, as it is moving, you hear just kind of generic sound of applause, and the kind of hypnotic glow and movement of the waves is supposed to be a replacement for your home entertainment system. And I think it's also an apt metaphor for the kind of hypnotic glow of our screens on our phones now. First generation has this nice play on it. It can be first generation technology, but also first generation family. So I love the way Carl is always playing with language. Carl originally showed this in the context of a art installation in a university art gallery, almost set up like a media device in a living room. But he also took it to the California State Fair and displayed it as a new product that you could buy to have in your own home. So I love that you actually followed through with that next step. And so I want to make sure we have time to get to questions, so I'm going to move us on quickly to this last kind of crucial couple sections of the show. Carl, you've also often remarked that for hundreds of years, artists have used paintbrush and chisel to make their work, and in the 21st century, artists really needed new tools, and 20th and 21st centuries, artists need new tools and technologies to make their work, and that Carl was looking for new ways to make his work. So he needed to start making art tools to make the kinds of art that he wanted to make. So the art tool is, we've had a lot of conversation. This is something Andres and I were talking about yesterday, about whether the art tool is the artwork itself, or is it the thing that the art tool produces, or is it that moment of interaction with the art tool? So in 1972, when Carl and Felice come back from their travels, Carl is working in the wood shop at UC Irvine, so it's been around the same time Chris Burden is a grad student, and you're playing around in the wood shop and you start making these prototypes for the art tool that are basically ways to move paint around. And you've joked this is your attempt at being a painter. So you're dragging and dropping and moving paint around with these devices. And it's also the same kind of paint that the Finnish fetish artists were using. So fast forward to the Natural Museum of Modern Art. The Natural Museum of Modern Art was the first kind of large-scale, and I'll actually maybe go here first, public art intervention that Carl did. So this was a self-initiated project. It's one of Carl's better-known works, where he took over the pier, a restaurant in the pier of Santa Monica, Sinbad's, and staged a public artwork, and also had a private studio on the second floor over the course of about a year and a half, from 1978 to 1980. Carl, do you want to talk about the Natural Museum of Modern Art? And I'm going to play the video for people to see it, because it's also a large-scale art tool.
Okay.
If I can get back to it.
This piece came out of coming back from Southeast Asia, and I thought that at that time I was committed to doing art in public places rather than in museums. I wanted to see what a real public would think about things. So this is before the public art programs got developed. So I just I talked to the pier manager into allowing me to use this condemned building to make a window piece, and so I did. And what I did was set up this thing called Natural Museum of Modern Art, and so I had all these little UAs, which are the unspecified artifacts that were that I put together into 10 dioramas in a control board, in which case on the pier you could put a quarter in, and you could pick one of these 10 dioramas, and it would, and go into the window area and see what it would do. There would be something that would happen. So what it was a big table of sand and a rake-like device that would scrape the sand clean and then come back and do something like this. If you picked this window, and if you picked another window, something else would happen. So through the year, I just started playing around with what a public is. I mean, on the pier, it's quite rough. They have people that are skateboarders, and they're just going for the beach, and there's a hot dog stand next to this place, and so this is what, if you came there and you selected something on that board with the 10 dioramas and went underneath that awning, you could see what it did, and that's how this came about. And what I saw, and a lot of times I was trying to fix the thing. It was all made up of leftover parts and stuff. So what I would see was that people, for one thing, would wait around till somebody put a quarter in, and then they would all rush in to see what it did. And so it wasn't actually the money that was there, but I was getting them to commit themselves to wanting to see something or expecting to see something. These are the dioramas, and they were all organic items that I'd made in Southeast Asia while traveling. And they had to pick something. They had no explanation. And that was the part where I could see in fact, I was looking for vocabulary. What is the most popular one of those 10? And which ones would they not like, or what, So I had some counters behind there to register which one they would select, and one of them won out when it happened to have wishbones in it, and I think the wishbones themselves did the thing. They identified with it, so that one became the most popular. But looking in the window, you would see this table of sand, and this rake would go by, rake it clean, and then some very primitive item would just mark the sand a little bit here and there. Like this, that would be considered the drawing that equaled that diorama. So it was quite abstract. So I would change them every, what one diorama did, I would just change it to what it did. What drawing came out of it would be something in another one in next week. So it was kind of monitoring this. This is probably the most creative strike of on the sand where this thing pivoted. So that was the nature of this Natural Museum of Modern Art.
But I love that there's a lot of Carl's works have this kind of reciprocity, or they ask you to, the emotional tools. You're being invited to project your own meaning onto a work. So what would these tools potentially be used for? You're asked to kind of participate in their meaning. Or you ask someone to put a quarter in and react to it. Or Carl has a series of meter board works that would react to your body. So I love that there's this kind of feedback loop between the things that you're making and the people who are experiencing them. So based on the kind of having had this experience doing a self-initiated public art project, Carl starts working in public art with a capital kind of PA, working with municipalities on competitions. He's invited in 1983, submits a project and wins a competition that's voted on by the public, beats out James Turrell, Nancy Holt, Larry Bell, artists like that, for a project called the Santa Monica Art Tool. So again, you've learned now about the art tool is a device that Carl makes to basically make the kind of art that he wants to make. And the Santa Monica Art Tool makes an artwork called Walk on LA. So let's see if we can get the video to work. And what you're seeing is a large-scale roller, a cement roller that rolls along the beach and imprints a kind of imaginary city of Los Angeles on the beach. So Carl made I think you said it was a 9-foot mold. Was that correct, Carl?
9-foot diameter.
9-foot diameter, 12-foot, I think, long. right? Mold of the city of Los Angeles, kind of replete with car crashes and little pileups, and the Coliseum that he made himself, and then worked with fabricators to imprint it on and make this concrete cylinder. So it makes this kind of print on the beach, this kind of endless scroll. We were talking last night about how that could also almost be like the endless kind of, I guess, sprawl of the suburbs in some way. We were talking about how, the orange groves were turning into tract homes. You could think of it that way. But really, ultimately, you have an average beachgoer encountering this incredible object. It's being dragged by a tractor from Santa Monica to Malibu, and you could stomp on the city like you're Godzilla, have this kind of childlike experience, but it also points to the kind of precarity of the built environment and how, all of this could kind of just be washed away, and it's actually quite fragile. So we have this represented in the show. So again, one of the real challenges was how to bring the outside in. So Carl has so many works that, exist out in public, like, for example, the Museum of Space Information, this incredible train station for Redondo Beach, that beamed in live feeds from NASA, for example, that was imagined as a kind of train station for the workers who were kind of helping to build the Hubble telescope in the factory across the street, to these large-scale art tools that don't exist anymore, like the solid rain installation that would go back and forth in this kind of Fortis production, dropping colored wax to make these wax paintings. So upstairs, you'll also find a 35-minute video that catalogs a lot of these large-scale works, ephemeral kinetic installations that were impossible to bring into this exhibition, but we wanted to at least create some context and world building around kind of the ambition and breadth of Carl's practice. And then finally, the exhibition concludes, is kind of bookended with, I think, some of the themes from the Anthropocene landscape with the sand rake art tool. So we were able to restore one major work. So there was a lot of, I think, conservation that happened in this show to bring works back up to exhibitionality. But in terms of restoring a major work, major art tool, we were able to work together collaboratively with multiple the other partner institutions in the show to restore the sand rake art tool. So what you're seeing here is a picture of Carl on the second floor of the Natural Museum of Modern Art, where he had his private studio, and he had the original prototype for the art tool that you're going to see upstairs. And so just to say also that a lot of Carl's work is in production over a long period of time. He's constantly refining it. Even in between the venues here, Carl is taking back parts of the tool to his studio and constantly kind of tweaking them and making them better in his perspective. And so the Santa Monica art tool, the sand rake, the art tool, produces a sand drawing. And what you're looking at is not a 3D print, but a long-form, durational, intuitive drawing that Carl is making with the sand rake. He is using the tool to drop water, blow air, roll a pattern, and he sits there for anywhere from 5 days to 2 weeks, and it just depends on how long it is. And so I'm showing you here some footage from the installation that we did at Red Cat, and makes this intuitive drawing. And so poignantly, Carl describes them as landscapes, and like the Santa Monica art tool and Walk on LA, this will be deinstalled at the end of the show. It is meant to be a kind of landscape. It points to the kind of precarity of the built environment. It's not the kind of monumental, Michael Heiser, the city. This is something that will is based on impermanence. It's based on in-person experience. Carl has to be here to make the work, so it's also based on Carl's body and perspective as an artist, because this is a tool that Carl has developed to make the kind of work that he wants to make. Carl, can you talk a little bit about the sand rake art tool?
Well, that's what it is. It's just something I keep playing with. The art tool is not, it's not a computer tool in any respect. It's kind of a clumsy analog item that sometimes I make it so it prints, other times I try to make it do drawings, but there's no such thing as a mistake in it. You just have to work with it till something happens. And that's sort of the challenge of working with this. So it's more like a performance for me to work with this thing. And so this is the way, I approach it. It isn't pre-formed in any respect. And whatever the rake can do at that moment is what it ends up doing. So I just work with it. And it's kind of ongoing,
And for every show, you're going to be making a new drawing, right?
Yeah, there's just no way to try to repeat anything. And I'm not trying to, so sometimes it does this, sometimes it does that, and it depends which tool I use.
But I think what Carl is kind of pointing to is that, he said that it's a mechanical technology. It's not it's not computational, and that's something that you'll see over and over again in Carl's work. He works a lot with technology, but it's always been a very physical, mechanical, analog form of technology. It's quite sophisticated, but it's very much based on the human. And I think that's maybe a nice place for us to maybe kind of conclude in terms of a thought, is that, as we're thinking about the rise of AI and all of these kind of systems, maybe going back to the kind of rigidity of the Anthropocene landscape of, like, no matter how sophisticated we get, we're still kind of based on this kind of rigidity that maybe almost starts to kind of take the human out of it. Like, Carl's work is so much based on the human. He talks about how there's no mistakes, right? It's a very physical, material process. He uses these technologies to make his work, but they're, at the end of the day, mechanical. They're things that you can fix. Like, you are modifying them. Like, if they break, that's something that's in your capacity to kind of, fix. But if it's computational, it starts to become outside of your capacity of as an artist to kind of work with them. And they also automation starts to leave the human. And I think that's something that I think a lot about with some of the things to kind of learn about from your practice.
Let's see. Well, thank you so much, Carl and Alex.
Thank you, Carl.
That was a really insightful and eye-opening conversation. Like Alex said, we're opening things up to questions from the audience. If you have a question, please just pop your hand up and wait for the mic so that the folks that are joining virtually can also hear what you're saying. So yeah, questions. Oh, I thought I saw a hand, but you were waving.
Hi, I have a question about, well, basically a lot of your work, clearly you're collecting a lot of objects over time. I think the first two pieces, the Anthropocene landscapes, is that correct? Those circuit boards, so clearly you're kind of like amassing a large collection of objects for many of these pieces. The avocados seem to be collected over decades, and I'm curious if when you started these projects, are you thinking about longevity when you begin? Are you planning for these projects to take decades, or is it just so happen that you kind of continue to work on these over time because that's where your interest lies?
I think the latter is what's more pertinent to what I'm doing. I don't predict or can predict how long I want to work on something. It just, it happens, and then if it ends, it ends, and that's pretty much it. Some things need to be constructed, so it will take longer, but it's not foretold how long or why. So it's just pretty much open-ended.
One of the things I'll just add to that is that, I feel so incredibly lucky that Carl allowed me to work with him on this project and to dig through his artistic underwear drawers, as it were, just really rummaging through everything. But Carl has kept everything, and I have such I guess high esteem for Carl, that he believed in his own practice and he kept it. And he, like, one of the things to point to is you'll see all these wonderful boxes and ways that there's containers for his objects, and he's built his own. You can see with this art tool here that he's kind of modified this suitcase and made all these little compartments so that everything fits in perfectly. And he talks a lot about resting mode and display mode. So the objects are, there's a convenience, right? He needs to have a way to store them in his studio, so he makes these great boxes when they're in resting mode. And then here they are on display mode, so they're almost like alive and activated. But, you could think about Duchamp with boîte en valise. There's the practicality of storage in your studio. There's also thinking about, Carl has talked about, like, when you encounter like a samurai sword, how it has a kind of display and then it goes back into its box. And then there's also the background that Carl has in product design. So there's a lot of kind of interesting ways of the way one could talk about storage in Carl's work.
Well, that's a real problem, storage.
Oh, hi. Hi, Carl and Alex. Thank you so much for sharing your work in this way. It's been super meaningful to engage and hear you talk about it, and to engage with the material in the exhibition today and yesterday. And I've been thinking about kind of the timescales that you're discussing, and the different kinds of, like with the erosion machines, the idea of like 1,000 years or 10,000 years for these processes to happen, and also thinking about the timescales and like forms of decision making, like mechanistic or human, and thinking about how that interfaces with John Doe Co. and the corporation as another mechanism or body, and the timescales of corporations. I was kind of wondering if in your work, I don't know if you've been thinking about like what is the timescale of John Doe Co. and is that like what happens with your work and this body, this corporation, that it will exist or could exist in perpetuity as long as corporations and governing bodies of them exist?
Well, first of all, I'm not a corporation. I'm a sole owner company. A company is just one person. When you apply for making a company, it's just sole proprietor. You can have partners, but a corporation must have partners, at least 2 or more. So I'm a sole proprietor company, which means when I perish, that company disappears. So that's pretty much how I look at it. Whether there's longevity in my artwork, that's another issue, which I haven't figured out all the details on how to deal with it. But I am just a company, and I think that's important, because as soon as you have more than one, then a corporation has a very different future and their aim and everything else. And a sole proprietorship is just anybody that wants to incorporate something that is official. So that's sort of how I deal with the idea. The company is just a way of, for me, in the beginning, because it is a deduction process, because if I'm an artist and I'm trying to deduct everything from pots and pans to mops and stuff, that doesn't correspond to making art. But if you're a company, then you can deduct all the things that you use to keep that company going. And that's the reason I did form a company, because I was using everything and anything to make things. And it wasn't like I'm using paintbrushes or some material that is legitimately artwork material. And if I was a painter and I was starting to deduct everything and, that I used, they would complain, or it wouldn't qualify. So that was the only reason I started a company in the first place. So that's pretty much what I did.
I think that's a really interesting question, though. I mean, we've been having a lot of conversations about what the future of the sand rake art tool is, for example. And as I mentioned, it's very much dependent on Carl to make it, which, you know, the meaning of the work is very much bound in some ways of by its ephemerality. So, you know, if we were, for example, to, you know, capture a 3D print and, you know, in 30 years or something, you know, be able to print it out and install it, would that still be the same work? And it wouldn't, right? So, you know, I think there's a lot of questions about the future of Carl's work and the meaning of Carl's work, and I think, you know, some of the heft of it in some ways is really predicated on liveness, on Carl, and the fact that it is ephemeral. But, you know, it's also, I will say it's been really wonderful having, you know, the Tangley Museum, for example, as a partner on this tour, because they have also been thinking about a lot of issues that are aligned with Carl's work synergistically in terms of, like, you know, automation and artwork that is produced through these kind of art, what Carl would call art tools. So there's still a lot of discussion to be had, but that's a great question.
Hi, I'm curious about how you were introduced as an artist who didn't really necessarily take part in institutions or kind of like commercial spaces, and then how you traveled out of the country into many places to kind of expand your artistry. And I wanted to know how, well, I guess not the decision, but coming back, how you decide to kind of place yourself, how you practiced your art, and then to today, like what your perspective or stance is, or what matters to you in being an artist in the way that you want to.
Well, it's kind of a process of growing up too. Leaving the country in the 60s was something a lot of artists did, because we were looking for something else. All the racism and Vietnam War really changed people that were young. So I did the same thing, but my experience in Southeast Asia changed me in terms of what I thought an artist would be, or should be. And I saw that there was artists that didn't produce much because they didn't have enough money. But to me, they were still artists because they had something valuable when you talked to them, and like poets. So when I came back, I was interested in working in the public. So art in public places was something I wanted to do. And then public art came about. So having an industrial design background allowed me to make drawings and present ideas, so that way the engineers could understand it so that I could make something. So that sort of fell in place, and instead of trying to be a gallery artist, I just started applying and competing with other artists to make projects in different municipalities in this country. And that's how I got by for a while. And at this point, after I did 10 projects in so many years, but as an artist, you could live quite a long time on one project because you can live very simply, and, you know, make it so you can live longer time with that, whatever project you got. So that's sort of how I, you know, was able to sort of stay out of the gallery product type of approach and survive. And later on, getting grants and stuff would help too. So that's sort of how I did it.
Thank you. I'll try to do the same.
Good luck.
Thanks, Carl.
Yeah.
Two questions somewhat related. One is really just my curiosity around the erosion machine. I think it was mentioned that there are 5. So I'd like to sort of hear from you sort of what the differences are between each 5. And secondly, again, hopefully somewhat related, I believe yesterday you mentioned the sand art tool, how you were making additions to it over time. So I'm kind of curious what your thought process is when you want to add to an existing art tool versus making an entirely different art tool, sort of what your thought process is.
Okay, on the erosion machines, originally I had them doing different things. I had these little nozzles that would squirt very sharply water in one area so it could drill a hole in it. So then I started messing around that way. And then later on, many years later, I just made it so that it was just an erosion machine and just washed the thing. So I kind of took away all these specific functions. and also the human rocks became, some of them maybe last, take 1,000 years, but some of them were within an hour. They were made with sand without any binder in it, so they would just crumble and you'd reveal something. So I went from one end to the other in terms of what the human rocks were made out of. So therefore I didn't need to drill a hole in it. But at first I was really very dedicated to making them function like a real tool where you can drill holes or slice one in half or something, which means you change the nozzle and make it squirt very sharply in one way. Later on I just made it generalized. So that's sort of what happened to the erosion machines after they sat around for decades, and I just started making them more universal. As far as the art tool, making multiple art tools, it was never an idea for me because it's so quirky that I'm not in total control of the rake. It's just lots of quirky things happen to it, and it doesn't perform in a. Otherwise, I'd be making 3D printers or something, if I really had precision. But I never did. I never intended to make anything that precise.
Hi, Carl. There's such like a craftsmanship to everything, and all of your pieces have a really strong visual quality. Like we've talked a lot about the conceptual through lines and all, but the aesthetic and formal just appeal of them is so strong. I guess I wonder if you could maybe express where you think some of your visual sources come from, where you think some of your where that comes from.
Well, there's the aesthetic part comes from yourself some way or another, how you feel about things. But working with the Charles and Ray Eames as a model maker, I learned an awful lot because those people had exquisite taste and they were very refined in their grace in every way. So everything they did showed it. I mean, they made furniture, they played around with films and really had a good time with collecting crazy stuff, So I learned a lot from them because they just had the right type of aesthetic. It comes from your person, what your aesthetic is. And developing that is something that comes from internally, how you feel about things. And so I tried to keep within a certain kind of, don't make it too sloppy, otherwise it won't work for one thing. Making it too precise, it gets boring. So somewhere between there, and also you're an artist, so you are making things that people see. So it's not something formal. It's something you just feel in yourself that you need it to be some look a certain way and do a certain thing. So that's about all I can say about it.
But maybe just to push that idea a little forward, I think the material quality of Carl's work is really important because Carl, again, can make everything. So there's no barrier between his idea and the output in some ways, and that's one of the things I've been really kind of impressed by is just that, again, that background in industrial design and the other kind of areas that he worked in, that he was able to really follow through an idea into realization really fluidly. You can look at the incredible drawings for the erosion machines, and they look like what they end up being, right? So they're really beautiful drawings, his incredible kind of draftsmanship, which you see more almost like as sketches and proof of concept, a lot of drawings that are made for kind of the public artwork proposals and things, just to see how things will work. And then the objects themselves really end up looking like the drawings, and Carl is making them himself. So I think that's a great question, and it's also kind of to acknowledge just the kind of the skill that he has as a maker, and that there's kind of no barriers for him in terms of materials. He's constantly experimenting.
We've got, well, actually, I'll pass it off to you and then
I think Ken had a question too.
My goodness. Okay, 3 more questions and then that's it.
Thank you. I really appreciate this discussion of art that calls back, I guess it still exists to some degree, but calls back a time when art was thought about in a very unfettered and more open way compared to the highly, circumscribed way of the market determining art, the business of art, the art world, art, the entertainment value of art. So I appreciate that because it's a good reminder, given that we're in a pedagogical setting, especially as a call for students. I guess my question has to do with your work calls up a lot of artists, and I feel a bit bad saying that because when you start calling up artists who are historicized and so on, then it's always seen as, well, Carl's not as historicized, if I may be blunt about that. Unfair that may be, but it calls up like Charles Biederman, and I think, but you're not a new materials type painter. It calls up Craig Kaufman, but then you're not a vacuum form artist. It calls up Ian Baxter and Anything Company, the bag landscapes and so on, but you're not an artist whose conceptualism is always one-eyed into the marketplace and the art world and how, and playing cheeky with that system of historicization. It's not like Agnes Denny either, who's kind of a great artist and who kind of occupied the margins of the art world primarily because she's a woman artist at that very male-centric time. So you're many of these artists, or Robert Smithson, or H.C. Westerman, a lot of artists who happen to all be white, almost all men are historicized, but you were there, and yet your work calls up those artists, but it's none of those artists. You're not a conceptual artist. It's much more authentic, much more driven by the kind of endless potential of art, if I can speak about it in those terms. But that leads me to my question, which is like, so there's a relative invisibility to you, in part, I think, as a Chinese American artist, because of your race and so on. So I wanted you just to maybe comment about that.
Well, I don't know. Whatever you do, there's always somebody you can refer to that did the same thing or did it even before you. But if you don't really care, you just do what you want to do. And I think that's personally what I've done. I'm not that affected by all this, And if people want to do things like me, I don't care about that either. So it's sort of, I'm just problem solving my own life. So what projects I use or what materials I use or, they can easily be associated with this and that in artists. And you could chop anybody up to, oh, this person did this, so you did that, that kind of stuff. But if you do the same thing all the time, then it gets into a rut. So basically, I'm not thinking in those terms. And this has to do with, like, if you're a fabricator, you're using all kinds of stuff, like if you're making a toaster, it's got filament wires in it that are heat up, nichrome wire, you have switches, you have plastic buttons, you have all types of stuff. So if you're carving a rock, that's a very different thing. So I'm not a carver, I'm a fabricator. So I just jump around to whatever is the best solution at the moment. And that's sort of it. I'm actually not...
Of course, that's what makes you such an interesting artist, was that because at that time it was very important to follow certain teleologies, certain channels, right?
This comes back to, like, in the early days of making art, artists only use one material. You're a carver or you're not, and this comes back to this idea of incorporating too, because in those days artists only used one types of stuff and you could deduct those things, but then here I am going to like someplace like Home Depot and using everything in it and trying to deduct every bit of it. I mean, that's a little bit different at that time. So now it doesn't matter, but back then it was more serious.
But maybe, Ken, to your point, I mean, there's a few things here that I'd like to pick up on. I mean, I think a lot about why Carl is not better known. Why didn't I learn about Carl in art school? Why didn't I learn about him in art history? I mean, this is, in some ways, my own curatorial work is about those cracks between those spaces between, artists, studio and, art history. And, I think there's a lot of reasons. I think, racism is certainly one part of it, but I think it's also the multimedia aspect of Carl's practice. I think it's the ephemerality and the process-based nature of Carl's practice. I mean, today we have, we've got Candace Lynn show up at Ulysses, and I think that's certainly an artist who would probably have loved to have learned about Carl's work in her generation as an artist, and now she can look to Carl maybe as a lost influence. But I also think it has to do with the move into public art, and there's a way in which the public art dimension world is not maybe seen in the same space as art. So there are a lot of different reasons, I think. And also Carl, I've through the process of interviewing Carl, I'm always like, who's in the room with you? Who are you talking to? I often will do the name dropping for him. He's not innately someone who is saying that he's part of a scene, even though he knows a lot of people. And when I talk to Ulysses Jenkins, for example, he goes, Carl saved my life. He let me stay in his studio for while he was traveling. And Carl will never bring this stuff up on his own. So there's also something about Carl as the way that artists maybe embed themselves in scenes, and Carl is kind of going to the rhythm of his own drum. I know early on in the project when people would say, who's Carl Cheng? I don't know the other artists. I'd say something like, well, it's kind of like if you took Hans Hake and Namjoon Paik and like Ant Farm and made another artist that's none of any of those things, but is maybe dealing with some of that stuff. And then increasingly that as I went deeper into the project, I was just thinking, Carl is being produced by the same moment that all those artists are. And artists are kind of aware of each other, and like what this show is really meant to do is to help continue to expand the narrative of that moment. And so when I say things like, that paint's the same paint that the Finnish fetish artist is using, it's not to say he's copying the Finnish fetish artist, it's just saying that artists are questioning industrial practices and looking at that landscape of California and articulating it in a lot of different ways, or responding to land. The West Coast artists are dealing with land in a very different way than the East Coast artists like Robert Smithson. And so you have Robert Smithson talking about entropy, you have Carl Cheng talking about erosion. So I think it's just important that we continue, whether it's Carl Cheng or any artist, to continue to be questioning how we're periodizing and codifying those art histories. So I hope that Carl now becomes another kind of spoke in the wheel. So just wanted to kind of add that into that. So,
hi.
Nice.
Hi. The show is a stunner, and it's a real contribution to the field. So I want to congratulate both of you and also thank you for giving us this gift. And I wanted to jump back to the ongoing conversation about materials and process. And given that the works are so much about ecological questions and ideas, and they are very connotative themselves, I'm actually curious about conservation of these works and what's involved, and what were some of the processes that you had to go through to continue to give them care over time, given that some of them are decades old?
That's a real problem.
So Carl, there are multiple things embedded in that question, Kelly. So there's the actual kind of objects coming out of Carl's studio. There are organic things like the avocados, which have been treated with different solutions to try to preserve them. Then there are the mechanical objects that are actually, we are constantly living with it. The tech is not seamless. So with every the wear and tear of these objects is real, and Carl is actually constantly helping us fix things. And so there's a real conversation about, I think, the future of these objects maintenance, and how Carl is going to help pass on the knowledge for institutions that now own some of these works, like the early warning system, for example. But then there are the public artworks. So the Santa Monica Art Tool sadly does not exist anymore. It was decommissioned in 2007 due to lack of maintenance. And Carl has talked a lot about this idea of human erosion, and human erosion being this idea that when you don't care for these things, for public artwork, for example, they will degrade over time and have to be destroyed. But it also maps onto this idea of human erosion of our environment, right? And then there are the kinetic installations that don't exist anymore. Either they were dismantled or they exist now in parts and objects. There are other art tools that now are sitting in Carl's studio, and I look to my museum colleagues in the room to say that there's still a lot more work to be done. So if the Sandrake art tool wows you, just know that there are more objects like that that could be brought back with Carl to help realize them. So it's a multidimensional question. And then just in terms of exhibitionality, our team did a lot of just basic work of putting new hanging supports on, just some kind of wear and tear issues that, when something's been sitting in a studio for multiple decades. So that's kind of a multi-layered question in terms of conservation. It's a great one.
Well, I think that's a great note for us to end on. Can we get one more round of applause for Alex and Carl? Thank you all once again for joining us. The galleries remain open today until 6 p.m. Carl Cheng, Nature Never Loses, will be on view here at ICA through April 6th. So we hope that we see you again throughout the run of the show. And just a quick reminder that there are refreshments on the mezzanine if you wanted to stay and kind of chat with each other for a bit. Thank you once again for coming.
Thank you again. Go see the artwork in person now.